welcome back to my 7th webinar. My name is Keith B. Dixon, and today we're going to talk about interior photography. And I'm going to share some tips that I use when I'm photographing interiors, whether it be residential, commercial, pretty much the same. I'll use the same type of processing, and I'm going to also share with you how I use Perfectly Clear in my workflow to either start a correction process or finish a correction process in my imaging. So before we get started, let me just make sure that everyone can hear the audio. So if you're having difficulty hearing me, just go ahead and send me a message and we'll get that worked out. But it looks like everything is good. We're going to get started, and I'm going to take you through some tips. I'm going to define a few things about what you should be looking for when you're processing your images, how to avoid certain things. I'm going to mention a few lenses that I use and lenses I've used in the past and the problems that you could run in with that. And we're going to get this show on the road. So let's get going here. All right, so we'll start out with some slides as usual. I'll cover some things, just give you a brief introduction in case this is your first time. And let's go ahead and get those going. All right. So I'm a commercial photographer. I'm based in San Francisco. I'm actually based in the Bay Area. My studio's here in Hayward, California. And I focus primarily on corporate events. So I do a lot of corporate events, print on site, and I have two other brands. I have a wedding brand that I photograph with, and that's Event Photographic. It's strictly consumer events, as well as an architectural brand that I've had for the last 5 years. And architectural work is very exacting. It's very specific, and the people that work in the industry that are going to see your work are very precise about how they want things seen, and distortion and quality. Those are all going to be really important, especially because most of the time they're going to go to print with those images in some magazine, poster, billboard. And the work that I'm going to show you today was done on a commercial level for a wine cellar. So that's what we have in store for today. All right, so if you're on any of the social media platforms, this is how you can find me. On Twitter, which is my biggest platform, we're just over 30,000 followers, and it's pretty active, pretty busy. If you want to just kind of keep up with what I'm doing in my network on a day-to-day basis, this is a great way, and it's a great way to see, what products I'm talking about, just all kinds of things. And then on Fridays, we have something called Follow Friday Frenzy. We do it. I do it once a month live, and but there's people in the network that will do it every week. So it's a good way to build your following. I'm also on Facebook, Keith B. Dixon. So send me a friend request. I'll definitely friend you back. It's a great way to see. If you're on Facebook, you can still see what's going on Twitter. And then examiner.com. And I just want to mention that a lot of the products that I use, I'll write about it in depth on here. And it's a little different format than your photography, your typical photography site. This is somewhat opinionated, and it's my experience. It's not. I don't write technical articles. I try to stay away from those. I want to share my user experience as a reality. Also on Pinterest, I like to say Pinterest is a collection of everything that I do. So if you want to see everything as a whole, that would be a good way to do it. And I'm also on G Plus as well. So and I use that more on the educational front with the students that are in my mentoring program and other programs that I do. So there's me, glimpse. Today, the one message that I definitely want to drive home is building an image. You have to create the perfect foundation for it. It's crucial. It's key. If you go in with a bad image, you're probably going to come out with a worse image. You go in with a great image, you're going to come out with a greater image, provided you have a process that you're following and you kind of have an idea as to where you want to go with that image. So building on top of a foundation is a great thing, a great foundation. It's just like a house. Okay, so Perfectly Clear is an image correction tool, and that's what I want you to know about this as you experiment with the program and you kind of go through the motions of fitting it into your workflow or using it, or however you're applying this tool. It's an image correction tool. You can use it as an enhancement tool as well. I mean, you can get creative with it. So I don't want you to get into the ideal of this is not an enhancement tool. It can be. It just depends on how you're using it. But for these purposes, we're using the correct images because there's third-party programs out there that do a lot of enhancements and all kinds of HDR and just everything. I want a tool that's gonna basically give me a good start. So if I'm shooting in a situation where I can't do an accurate white balance and I've got to rely on the camera, whatever the case may be, I want a tool that's going to help me out, that's going to decrease my workflow time and increase my profitability as a photographer. So before we get started, I want to talk about file structure. File structure is really important. It's the one thing that kind of gets us turned around, especially when you are creating several versions of an image. I mean, your workflow could turn into spaghetti. And that's why I like to really be defined about this. And I'm going to show you a simple workflow. You can scale it out any kind of way that you want. But if you're a new person, this is going to be something that's really beneficial to you. If you've been around a little while, maybe you're going to find something in here you can tweak and make better for yourself and include in your workflow. That's the goal. Something you should be doing right off the top, and I got to tell you that I am heavily vested in storage and redundancy and just everything related to protecting the file. Because if you're in a unique situation, a wedding, or some client has spent $5,000, $6,000, just a small budget, $5,000, $6,000 staging a scene. The ability to go back and do that it's going to be difficult, especially if it took a month to just get everything approved. So you want to make sure that you protect your images as much as possible right from the file source. So a lot of the times I will use cameras with 2 drives so that I can record backups. That's one, right? And you can use it that way. Sometimes it's recording on the 2 different drives, a destination drive and a backup drive. Sometimes it's 3. It just depends on the magnitude of the shoot. And that's what I want you to know. And if you look deeper, I know the print is small here, you'll notice I use a numbering system. That's because if I'm working with an assistant and I need them to access a particular file, whatever the case may be, I can say, hey, go to 1000, folder 1000, folder 2000, folder 3000, whatever the case may be, and then go in and find the person's name. It's a real simple process. So that's the way that I actually store my imaging. Okay, let me just check in, make sure that you guys are hearing me okay. And we don't have any questions out there. Okay, everything's looking good. I'm just going to continue right through this. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about. How about that, huh? Okay. So Lightroom is a primary tool that I use, especially in relationship to Perfectly Clear. There are a lot of other tools, and I want to tell you the tools that I use are very specific to the types of jobs that I do. So some clients are familiar with a lot of other programs out there that you can manage images in. If that's the case, I'm using that because that's what they're familiar with. I'm familiar with it as well. In this case, the mainstream is Lightroom. I've been using it for years. Um, there's a lot of benefits to it, and this is the platform we're mostly going to work on. But there are other platforms as well, and I just want you to know that. But for this presentation, for this webinar, we're going to use Lightroom. Okay, so we're going to talk about indirectly, we're going to talk about tone, color saturation, and color temperature. These are the 2 or the 3 things that really make shooting interior images challenging, because there could be different tones, there could be different colors all over the place. A predominant color, which means that you have more yellow in the scene than you do red. There's just a lot of variables that you sometimes can't control. And to be perfectly honest, when people are staging an interior or they're designing it, it's really designed around our eye, not the camera's eye. So you run into those challenges as well. So I'll tell you just kind of how I tackle it from a color saturation, color temperature standpoint, and the things that I do. Tones are very interesting because, and here's a photograph, and I want you to see. We're not going to go into detail about this because we got to jump into the images. But what I want you to do is I want you to see the difference between the light and the dark. Everything in the middle, if we look down at that histogram, everything in the middle is going to be kind of like your middle gray. And as you can see, there's not a lot of it in here according to this histogram. Most of our tones are going to be riding up on the left, on the dark side, or the right. And it looks like some of the images, or some of the images, clipped off. So if you go, if you start right here and you're looking, this is riding up against it, it's clipped out. You can see it's really dark in there. So this is going to be lost information or lost detail. We can slide the shadow sliding over or slider over in most programs, and what it's going to do is it's going to start artifacting and breaking apart. I like to say breaking apart. It gets people's attention. So your images start to fall apart the minute you start sliding them over, especially on an enlargement. It's just going to look horrible. And the more you sharpen and soften, the worse it's just going to look like a painting almost. So it just completely changes the context of the image once you start doing that stuff. So I want you to know that. And a lot of the higher end cameras, you can sharpen in the camera. You come out sharpen, sharpen, sharpen. So, you know, your image is over sharpened. So there's a lot of approaches. Here's our most middle right here. This is our most middle gray. And then over here, we're just starting to get into, you know, overblown highlights. And when you try to basically turn those highlights down or the whites down, this is going to turn gray, muddy. It's just going to look ridiculous. So be careful. This is a high, I would say high contrast from here to here. The contrast is super high. The rendering, the only way you're going to get an image like this is you're going to create an exposure for just this area, and you're also going to create probably a middle gray, slightly over middle gray exposure just to get the sky right. And that all depends on how that scene looks to your eye. So keep that in mind. How does the scene? Do you remember what the scene looks like? And does that photograph represent your scene? That's the message that you want to send visually, I think, based on the image you're producing. All right. Color temperature is interesting because it could be intentional and it could be unintentional. Unintentional meaning that it's just got a color cast in it, you don't know it, and the image looks great. You know, does it look great printed? You know, color cast, and I want you to think of color cast in terms of layers, right? I want you to think of color cast in terms of layers, and with layers, you tend to have color layers, and then you drop, you know, a film on top of that. I mean, you just got a disaster working. So here's a cool color and a warm color. And if we tone the blue down just a little bit, maybe we'd probably have a perfect temperature, right? But we could use, you know, a slightly warmer edge on this. Maybe it would make the photo look good. I don't know. It's really subjective sometimes. But at the end of the day, you just don't want to color cast as a result of your temperature being either too warm or too cool. Okay, so let's go into what I call the creative zone. Let's start looking at this creatively. So I'm going to jump over to Lightroom here. Okay, so here's the cellar I was telling you about. And as you can see, it's very narrow and it has a lot of depth from the front to the back. This is a pretty good perspective of um, where I'm shooting from, and it's probably really the only perspective. The minute you start changing angles, and in my creative zone concept, I have something called the religious point of view that forces you to look at images from at least 5 different perspectives to determine which perspective is going to work the best, number one, and number two, to give you at least 5 perspectives. So I do have all the perspectives here, but the static straight on one is one that I used, and I'm going to show you a finished image. So let's tackle this for a second. The first thing I'm going to look for is the color temperature. So I'm looking at that blue light, which is extremely close to my camera, right? And there's a lot of ways to deal with that, right? We can white balance for that. Um, by creating we can take an expo disc and just, if it's blaring out, and we can neutralize that with the expo disc. That's one way. So we would take our expo disc and we would point it at this blue light, and it would just basically neutralize or knock down that blue light so it doesn't interfere with the existing ambient light, which is predominantly tungsten. But we have these LED or um, these fluorescent style lights, LEDs, right? In conjunction with some light covers that are giving off a tungsten feel. So it's just, this is a weird situation. And then we have LED lights there. Um, let's say, oh, let me point out a few things because I see this a lot, especially with some of the, I like to call them run and gun interior photographers. I see this a lot. So you notice how this line is converging down. Well, in a situation like this where it's really narrow, the thing that you want to consider is how much is it converging down, right? Is it so obvious that it just makes the image look terrible? And there's ways you can do that. So if you adjust your camera up, the lines are going to go down. If you adjust your camera down, the lines are going to go up. This is to get this as neat as possible. You really have to look through here and position your camera just at the right height so that those lines aren't going too far down or too far up. Either way, you're going to be losing something. So you have to find the striking middle of to really make an image like this work. In terms of the processing, you'll notice that there's a lot of deep, dark cavities here, right? Um, and even in here. And even in the background, I'm going to enlarge this here. Even in the background. Um, here's what I'm going to tell you. If you're using a kit lens at f8, shutter on a tripod, you should be on a tripod. Kit lens, f8. There's a good possibility you can get a sharp image. It's not going to be as sharp as a $2,000 lens, but if you're in the sweet spot for that lens and you're shooting it at infinity, there's a good possibility you can get um, a sharp image. But if it's only f8 and this depth is requiring f11, f13, then your image is going to start to lose its sharpness. And those are the problems that you're going to run into with those kit lenses. You may also get a lot of chromatic aberrations and refraction and all those elements. And I'm not going to go too much into detail about that because it's just those words and those issues alone is a whole webinar, literally. And but those are the kind of things that can happen, right? Now, naturally, what most people would do in a situation like this is they would turn this into an HDR image, and just to bring out these shadow values just a little bit and the knockdown. There's actually an overhead light here that's creating this to knock down the highlights to create that perfect grayscale image that looks something like this. And this is the finished image, right? It's been merged and, I've worked it a little bit. And as you can see, we don't have those deep shadow values anymore. And this is an image that they actually are printing in their ads and posters and all kinds of things. You could see we don't have that light that we saw here. We don't have that anymore. Well, let's say you're just starting out. You don't have a lot of tools, and you've captured or bracketed your images. And I'm going to show you some bracketed images here. I'm shooting at f11 here, and as you can see, 1.6 seconds. Contrary to what most people might think, I'm shooting at 400 ISO. I'm on a Nikon platform, when I photographed this, I think I might have been using a D300. So not an elaborate camera at all. I mean, it's a semi-pro camera, um, not even a prosumer camera. Let's redefine that. So the D300 is a prosumer camera. It's a great camera. It's great. It was a great production for Nikon. That's what I'm using. It shoots a really good 400 ISO, and that's why I was able to get that image that I showed you before. I'm using a 12 to 24 DX lens. So, and the reason for me using a DX lens versus a wider lens is it's a matter of style and technique that I use to maintain sharpness. Because of the angle of view, it's not as wide. There's a lot of factors that go into why I would use the DX here as opposed to a wider angle. The thing that I'm going to tell you is it has a lot to do with just maintaining the sharpness because of the DX sensor and the tight space. So in tight spaces, here's the tip. I'm not going to go into describing the total process, but in a tight space, typically I will use a DX or on a Nikon platform, I'll use a DX or a crop sensor, a DX lens and a crop sensor in a tight space. And it really depends on the condition, right? So I ran this through another program that I use and created the merge. But what I want to show you is, let's say you're not familiar with all that, and that's not something that you're interested in doing, right? You don't want to merge the photos, right? You want to take the most middle gray image, and let's see what we can work with here. Let's take this one because we're going to rely on, let's see here. Let's take this one. We're going to rely on Lightroom, right? Lightroom's pretty powerful. We're going to rely on Lightroom and Perfectly Clear to basically manage this image. And I'm going to work backwards this time. I'm going to make all of my corrections because I don't have 2,000 images that I have to go through. I might have to go through 5. So I can spend time with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to bump my shadows up just to see what's going to happen, right? Oh, there we go. I'm going to enlarge that because I want to make sure that I'm not introducing too much grain and turning up those shadows. And as you can see, it is introducing a little bit of grain. I'm going to work right here in one-to-one view, right? I'm going to go in here and I'm going to basically go down to noise reduction. I'm going to reduce that noise down. And the thing that I like to do is I like to drag the sliders over to see how much it's going to change the image. And as you can see, it just got really soft almost. So I'm just going to do like a little bit of noise reduction right there. Right? And I'm going to zoom back out. So we're almost there. I mean, that's one slider, right? And in Lightroom, I'm going to show you this white balance, right? In Lightroom, I can go to something that resembles a middle gray, like right here, and just sample it. Okay, and now I've just white balanced my image, right? So when I go into Perfectly Clear, I don't have to worry about clicking on the tint button. I'm just going to go into Perfectly Clear to basically clean up my image and make sure it doesn't have a lot of noise in it based on this first shadow slider that I slid all the way over to bring up my shadow values. So you see how that worked out? So if I take my sliders, if I just hit the reset button here, right, I've got basically image loss right in here. You see that? Especially down in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn the shadow value all the way up, and basically I enlarged it to see just how much grain was going to be introduced from lifting the shadow values, and to just compensate for that, it's almost like I want you to think of a seesaw, right? I'm just going to slide this over to about right there just to reduce some of the noise, right? And reduce some of the contrast between the pixels. So we call this pixel pushing, right? All right, I'm going to zoom back out here. So, in a worst case scenario, I mean, that kind of bothers me a little bit. That light is so bright, right? Compared to this image, where the processing will just basically distract you from the fact that this light is just super bright over here, right? We still have like a great difference between our foreground, which seems a lot brighter than our background. Do you see the difference there? And I'll bring these up side by side just so you can kind of get a feel for where the image is going. Okay, so as you can see, we've pretty much got a good balance between our foreground light right here. Let me make this just a little bigger. We've got a good balance between our foreground light and our background light. So here our foreground light is just like, because there's an overhead light there, and in a situation like this, sometimes I'll scrim off that light if I'm gonna would basically just cover it if it's really a nuisance or a problem, right? Um, and we could work that light down just in creating exposures, right? So that's another option. But I just want to get even light from the foreground to the background versus here where it's just slightly darker in there. And these are the small details that people tend to look at. And you could get away with this, don't get me wrong, but this right here, you see the difference in the barrels, right? So let's go back to develop mode. Let's get on our image. Okay, so here we are. And the thing that I'm going to do next is I'm going to go over to develop mode, and I'm just going to turn down the highlight all the way down. Boom. This is the power in Lightroom, right? We just solved that problem. Now we're getting closer. Our foreground light is not overwhelming our background light, right? We just turned it down, right? The thing you want to be careful about is how the color is changing as well, because that barrel is lit. Maybe that's the actual tonal color of the barrel. Maybe not. You're going to know just because you were there, right? So maybe that's it right there. All right. So there's our Lightroom fix right there. I'm not sure that the color is actually totally correct, and maybe there's some things that I'm not seeing with my eye, and this is where perfectly clear is going to really come into play. And there's a couple different ways to get to it. So I'm pretty satisfied that um, this image is going to work for right now. And the other thing, I'm going to sidebar just a little bit. I like to go off script sometimes. Um, Lightroom has this great feature that automatically corrects and analyzes your lens to make sure that, oh, you see that? Just going to go right in here. You see how it corrected its perspective there? So I'm just clicking auto, and it's just straightening the image out based on how it's reading the file. So we're pretty good. And if you click on manual, sometimes you have to do this. And I told you I'd talk about some lenses. I use a Nikon 14 to 24 and also a Rokinon 14 millimeter. And the thing that I want to tell you about the Rokinon 14 millimeter prime, it's an all manual lens, so you have to do everything. There's no auto anything. And here's what you need to know about that lens. It's really sharp at f11, f8 in between there. Super sharp. I could shoot an image on the 14 to 24 or the Nikon 14 prime and shoot it on the Rokinon. You wouldn't know the difference. But when in close quarters and tight spaces, the Rokinon distorts tremendously. And when I say tremendously, I'm not exaggerating. It distorts a lot. So um, I definitely would not recommend a Rokinon in a tight space. You're going to get just crazy distortion, and you're going to be more frustrated than you are satisfied with. And the difference is the Rokinon lens. You can find a good one online, maybe Craigslist or third party for under $300-400. The 14 to 24 is going to cost you about $2,000, and a 14 prime probably around 17,000. So I mean 1700. So you get what you pay for in a sense. Keep that in mind. Okay, so let's take this image in, and there's a couple different ways. You can go File, Export, um, File, Export, and that'll open up this dialog box, and we can select perfectly clear here, right? And there's a couple different things we could do. We have here, I have user presets, but I'm gonna just click over to system presets, and there's a host of different types of presets. But since I'm not batching images and I'm not processing a lot of images, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna basically take this right in. I'm not gonna hide it. If I was doing about 100 images, I just click hide perfectly clear and let perfectly clear do its thing. This is a raw file. I shoot only raw files, by the way. So I don't shoot JPEGs. Matter of fact, I can't even remember the last time I shot a JPEG. I do give them to the clients though, and TIFF files as well. You can pick your destination here for where you want to go. You can do your file naming, everything else that you would normally do in Lightroom. So before I take this image out, I'm just going to check in really quick here. See if we have any questions. Okay, it looks like it's going really good here. Okay, and I'm just going to click export, and I'm going to show you another way to do it as well, so that you can see um, how it's done. Okay, so that's one way. So all we're going to do is we're going to go and click export and export to perfectly clear. Click export the file, and you're there. Okay, so here's another way, and this is a shortcut, and it'll place the image right next to the original image. It's just go right in, edit in, perfectly clear, and I like to do this when I'm not batching a lot of images. You can save it in a TIFF, JPEG, or Photoshop. I use 16-bit. Resolution, you can go 240 or 300, and I use zip compression. So these are pretty typical settings. Why? If you're printing, 240 is actually going to be really good. And for compression, it's just how big or small do you want the file size. The other choices, lossy, and you can just select none. And this is one that I use as well for TIFF. But for just the sake of this, I'm going to select JPEG 240 and click edit. And it's going to open up. This is a pretty big size file too, by the way. Let's take a peek here. I want to see just how big this file is. We've made some adjustments and added some instructions to it, so we probably increased the file size. Here we are. Okay, so we got 6,000 by 4,000. And as you can see, 24 to 24. Oh, I was using the 24 to 85 on this. Okay, so I used a 24 to 85 on this. It was kind of interesting. That's another lens that fairly inexpensive, and okay. And I shot this on a full frame, so D600 24 to 85. Kind of interesting. I must have been experimenting right there. Okay, so let's roll on. All right, so perfectly clear is alerting me. Okay, and here's our image, as you can see. Pretty good, right? So I'm just going to click over here to presets. And the thing that I love about this program the most, especially when I'm in a hurry, and just this week alone, I've been shooting every single day. As a matter of fact, I just shot a job this morning, and I've got to process 140 images for a client. And I'm going to, as soon as we're done with this webinar, I'm just going to pop those images onto the drive and basically push them right into perfectly clear and out, pick, upload, and I'm done. Literally. I mean, that's how fast I have to work. Okay, so remember, we did a white balance. We in Lightroom, we took our eyedropper and we clicked on the barrel, right? So if we click here, and I actually like that a lot better in terms of the white balance. And I'm just gonna open these up side by side so you can see the difference. My work tends to be a little bit more on the cooler side, and that's a preference, but I like that tint versus the correction that we did in Lightroom. So that is beautiful right there. And as you can see the difference there, I'm just gonna, and you can see the big difference there, right? You see how I just totally changed it. So I'm pretty good with that. If I wanted to do something just a little extra, I could click on adjust. And by the way, you can create presets for this. And this is the beauty in this program, right? We can create a preset to always do exactly what we're about to do here. The one thing that I want to do is I want to click on noise, because I want to see if any noise is going to be detected from lifting those shadow values in there, and none was, because they're most likely going to print this image, and I don't want to have them enlarge it and then it's artifacting. And artifacting is kind of when you see, those red, blue, and green pixels in there. You'll see lines or edges. It's just, artifacting is a trippy thing, and sometimes you can't even see it until you enlarge the image, and it's almost embarrassing too. Now, remember I told you enhancing and correcting are two different things. We're going to cheat a little bit, right? Because I've already done what I thought was my correcting, right? Just by pulling up the sliders and doing some things, right? I'm going to go into a little bit more enhancing by sharpening the image. And the thing I like to do is I like to drag it over all the way just to see, what sharpening is going to give me at its full value. That way I'll know how much to back off. and I like to zoom in. And what I'll do is I'll look to the back, and you see where it's starting to artifact there. I mean, it's just over sharpened, right? Now, here's the interesting thing. I've printed some images that I thought were over sharpened, and they didn't show up in the print. I mean, they look pretty good. So the thing I'm going to tell you is it's going to be a trial and error thing, and you see it's artifacting there. So I'm just going to back off that, right? And usually when I'm applying these sliders, what I'll do is I'll enlarge the image to 60, 100, 1:1, whatever the case. And I'm looking at the back, and because this is where I expect most of the image quality to fall off because of the type of lens. I was using a 24 to 85 on a crop sensor. So I'm just going to back off that just a little bit more to about right there. And it takes once I slide it, it'll take a few seconds and it'll make the adjustment, right? And I'm going to zoom back out. And you know what? We're pretty much there. And if I want, I can crop that refrigerator out and do something like this, you know. And as you can see, it changed our lines. It kind of lessened our convergence there. And it's taking the best of a worst situation. So there you can see it. It's so obvious. It's like driving straight to the back. If we crop up past that refrigerator, right, now we have it. And that's how I want you to think about it. And if you wanted to play around, you could add a little vibrancy to it, to kind of pump up the colors, whatever the case may be. You can play with these sliders. And now I'm just going to go back. And if I wanted to create a preset, I could do that as well, right? Maybe I can go in here. You see where details completely change the image, right? Vivid, right? Vivid kind of, what I've seen with Vivid and Perfectly Cure, just kind of darkens around the edges a lot more, right? Landscape gives you, so if you're out in a bright situation, the one thing I notice about landscape is it lowers the brightness more than anything. It adds more of a dark, contrasting type of feel with the landscape preset here. So I'm going to go back to my original tint, right? And if you click save, it's just going to take the image right back into Photoshop. And you can actually, if you know that you're going to be processing a lot of images like that, and there's our final, which I think actually looks better than our original. So I'm just going to, let's bring them up side by side. And I got to tell you, this was actually I shot this image Perfectly Clear. So I didn't use Perfectly Clear on this image right here. This is old processing. I'm going to just take that one out. I'm going to bring up our flagged images here. As you can see, the processing is just a lot cleaner. We don't have that cast in there that we see. It's just a lot cleaner image. And if I go in, I'm just going to unflag that. If I go in and I crop, because I don't think we need that refrigerator there, right? And it's better to have it than not. I mean, to go in and shoot and just crop that out automatically. Well, I'm going to crop that to a 5:7. If I know that they're going to do enlargements, sometimes what I'll do is I'll go down here and I'll do 16:20. Because the last ad I shot for them, they actually had these posters in the hallway, because this is inside of a resort, in the lobby of the resort. So now that I know that, I'm going to give them a 16:20 perspective. And you see where we lose the edge? I'm just going to slide that over just like that. So I keep the ground, right? And boom. Or that's one, I'll submit that as an option, right? It's not so static now. Or what I'll do is I'll go, oh, that's 8:10, 16:20. Okay, so that'll still work, right? What I'll do is I'll go in, and if you're shooting a crop sensor, that 8:10, that 16:20 is going to be a little weird on the crop. So I just want to warn you of that. That's the benefit of having the full frame, is what you just see right here. So you get a nice squared box, right? And 16:20, the 8:10 will work as well, because we can go 16:20, because we're just doubling 8 and doubling 10 to get to 16:20. So if we go in here and we do a 5:7, right? You see, we lost some here and we lost a lot here, right? And that's pretty much what our image looks like, right? And we can play with it. I just hit the X button, right? You can play with it and kind of move, and you could actually submit these to the client so that you already have all the perspectives and angles covered that they might have that they may not want or know how to crop to. See, and that's the benefit. And I'm just hitting X on the keyboard, right? So I'm just gonna hit reset here. Okay, so there's our image. So I'm just gonna select 5 by 7, right? And I'm gonna crop that refrigerator out. And I have the perspective locked because I want to keep the perspective the same. I want the floor, and I want as much as the edge over there as I can get. I'm gonna cut that. I don't want to cut the bottle in half, so I'm gonna stop right about there, right? And that's gonna be the image I'm gonna submit to the client. We have minimal distortion, considering that this is a long rectangle, right, with driving lines, probably in the worst place that you could be in for a lens, right? We have driving lines. Not bad, right? And one feature that I want to share with you in Lightroom that you can definitely toy around with, or if you get into trouble with distortion, is you go down the lens correction, click on manual, and the distortion in control in here is definitely a lot better. You see how we're starting to get that circular effect around the edges? Well, if I start to go back to center, you'll notice that the lines are going to be straight right about there. You see that? Too much. Right about there. Right? And as the lines are driving down, it makes the image seem like it's tilting backwards, right? And that's when you can kind of get into the horizontal control, right? Because sometimes they'll go left or right. You can scale it up, right? And you can also, if it's turning or look like it's going downward as it goes back, you can use vertical to kind of tilt the image, right? So there's a lot of possibilities here, right? In aspect. I use aspect a lot sometimes in small rooms where I have to use a full frame camera with a wide angle, because maybe some of the architecture, the thing that you don't want to do is cut off, like if the architecture in the ceiling is like there's a special type of beam in the ceiling and it connects somewhere. You don't want to cut that off, so you're forced to use that super wide angle lens, and it just gets to be tricky sometimes. And so you really got to know what you're doing. But in this case, Lightroom, helps us out a lot in terms of that. So as you can see, this is I'm going to turn this off here and just go back. Here's an image that was perfectly clear, right? And I could just go in here and white balance off that little strip, but as you can see, it didn't make too much difference compared to using perfectly clear. I mean, we just got a clean image right here. So that's definitely the difference. All right, I'm going to show you one more image. We got about 20 minutes. Let me just check in. Okay, we're doing good here. All right, let's take a look at another part of. So I showed you basically how to do it without merging images, because maybe you're just starting out. Architectural, they're not going to give you a budget if you're unnamed or unknown. You don't have a track record. They're going to try to get you to do the stuff for free and tell you that it's going to benefit you and your portfolio. So get ready for it. It's going to happen until you build a name for yourself. It's going to happen. And sometimes they'll have you come out and shoot the property, look at the images, and decide they don't like them, and they won't even use them because it didn't cost them anything. So if you're just starting out and you're working for free, there's nothing wrong with working for free. Matter of fact, if you go to examiner.com and you dive into my article section, I talk about how to work for free and how to have it benefit you. And that's the key, benefiting you. All right, as well as the client. All right, so here's another set of bracketed images. And let's say I don't have merging capability. I don't know anything about it. I don't know where to start. I don't even have time to do it, right? Let's take this one. So this cabinet is curved right there. It just has a little curvature in the front. Let's see. Let me see which one I want to work with. I like this one better. We had enough of the refrigerator. So here's the low end of my exposure. and here's the high end of my exposure. And what I did is I went in, I merged these together, and I use a specific program. I have been for years to do it. I haven't deviated from it because it just works. Um, but let's say you don't have that program because it costs $100, right? And you don't have $100 because you didn't get paid for doing this job, right? As a matter of fact, you don't have a great lens, right? But you just happen to catch a good exposure in the middle. Let's say, let's say I'm looking at the histogram here as I'm making my decision. I don't want one that's going to clip, so I'm going to take this one. And when I say clip, you see this edge over here, right? We can click on that. It'll show us kind of where the highlights are, where the blinkies are. That'll tell us how much our image, you see where it came on here? It'll tell us where it's overexposed and where it's underexposed, right? So I want the image that's going to give me the perfect start. And that's a tip, by the way. So right there, as you can see, that's lost detail, right? So we have less lost detail right here. So I'm going to take that image, but I actually like this one a little better. But I'm going to I'm going to trust the program, right? Okay, so here's our image, and as you remember that before, I just took the shadow slider and slid it right over. Yep, plus 100, right? We can do it in that case, right? If we slide it over there, right, we're going to get that effect. We're going to close down our shadow values. We're going to increase our shadow values there because we don't have merging capability. Matter of fact, my camera broke. It didn't, but I'm going to say my camera broke as my bracketing button broke. I wasn't able to do it, right? So I had to do it manually, and here I am, right? And you can play with the blacks here, right? But you see as you turn up the blacks here, if we enlarge, we start to get a little noise, right? Not too bad, right? But I'm going to just turn this black down about right there because I don't want to basically lose the tone in my color in the wood, right? So I'm just going to go about right here. All right. So this is going to be a matter of taste. Sometimes I'll adjust the white sliders up and down just to see what it's going to do, right? But I want to be able to see the outline of that light. I don't want that to be overexposed. And sometimes it's really difficult to do. So you really have to be spot on with your exposure and your metering when you're creating these shots. And also, you see how you can't really see this book here? Well, if we turn down the highlights, we can see it, right? You see that? It's going to be a lot better. There's a light that's coming down that's creating this difference in contrast here, right? I want that book to be in focus because I want to show detail. So I just turned down the highlights, right? I'm just going to bump up my clarity just a little bit, right? Just a tad. And then you notice I haven't went to the exposure yet, right? Because I thought my exposure was perfect. I'm just going to turn the exposure up, right? I'm going to add a little bit of clarity because it was starting to get a little contrasty in terms of not having any, right? And I'm going to go down here and basically just add a little bit of sharpening, right? Just a little bit and a little bit of noise reduction. Matter of fact, I'm gonna go back on the sharpening because I'm gonna do that in perfectly clear, right? I want a little bit. I just want it to have a little bit more pop, so I'm gonna just turn up my exposure just a little bit. So I'm turning things down and I'm turning certain things up. Okay, how do you do that, Keith? Like Keith, how do you know to do that? To be perfectly honest, it's just from doing it a lot. There's just certain things that I see in the images, and I know to do. Can I give you a starting point? The only starting point that I can really give you is adjust your exposure last. Go in with, if you're going to do your images this way, go in with the best exposure value possible for the image and then make your adjustments based on the high. I always go after the shadows first because typically, that's where you're going to run into the most problems and then the highlights. So always go to the shadows first and then adjust the highlights. And it's almost like you're just doing the inverse of whatever you're doing. Let's go into perfectly clear. And all I'm doing is I'm just hitting control, edit in, and I'm going to bring up perfectly clear right here. And as it's working in the background, as you can see, it's pretty quick, right? This file is pretty big. This was shot on a Nikon D600. By the way, while this is processing, Athentech does a monthly newsletter. There's an article in there where I talk about contrast, and I talk about processing and a lot of other topics. So if you look at their newsletter and you go to their blog, let's just switch over there while that's processing. They have a great blog. Oh, matter of fact, you can win a MacBook Pro. So enter now. And I know everybody could use a computer. Here's that article: Flat Colors and Dynamic Range. So it's an article that I wrote. There's also Scott Stolberg. So there's some good stuff on here, right? If you're a wedding photographer, Williams Ennis. So hey, we got you covered here, right? Go to the Athentech blog and just explore some of these articles. I usually try to get an article out once a month that Athentech will include on something. Just kind of depends on my schedule, but I generally like to share. But here's the blog, and then if you want to see where if you want to go to the webinars and where they are, so attend a webinar, here's a schedule for all the webinars that are coming up. So, oh, there we go, right there. Okay, so let's get back to business here. It's perfectly clear, alerting me. Okay, so we've already kind of did our whole tent fix, so we don't really need to. We can rule this out. I want to go to details, right? That's where I want to be. It's looking good. It's looking good. We're still pretty sharp there, right? We don't have any artifacting. Our image is not breaking apart, right? We're looking good. So I can kind of play around here a little bit, right? Vivid. Vivid is just going to give me a little bit more contrast, as you can see. And that's a decision you're going to have to make when you're using the two. And I'm just clicking back and forth so you can kind of see, right? I don't know. I kind of like Vivid a little bit, right? I want to check the noise, right? And one of the ways and this is where I'm using the program out of context. I want to see if there's noise in my picture. I know they put it here so that you can do it, but I want to go in here. Noise has been detected. So there is a little bit of noise in here, and I kind of thought it was gonna be because we really pushed the pixel on here. All right, so let's pick. We want to get that noise out of there. So we're gonna do our thing right there. Oh boy, look at that. You see the difference there? Oh boy. Okay, that looks rich. Okay, I love it. All right, now we can sharpen in here as well, right? I'm going to drag the sharpener all the way over. You see how it just really popped out, right? I'm going to go in and enlarge because I want to make sure that it doesn't artifact or I don't have any funny things going on. It doesn't look over sharpened, right? You see where in the highlights where we're starting to break apart here. So I'm just going to tone that back just slightly. Wait for it to. By the way, I'm working on a MacBook Air, right? I'm working on a MacBook Air. And we're not looking at this at total full resolution. I mean, it's just, we're only up at 60%. All right, I'm gonna go back, go right back down, bring this in. We're looking pretty good right there. All right, there's our image. So if I click on it, that's kind of where we started. And this is all just one image, picking a middle gray exposure and running it through perfectly clear, making some adjustments in Lightroom and running it through perfectly clear on the inside. Sometimes you'll hear me say in my webinars how I use perfectly clear to run the images through right from the very start. And then sometimes, because we're using Lightroom, I'm assuming that a lot of us are using Lightroom. We've developed these presets and we spent time on them. A preset is not something you just want to throw away. I mean, you spent time developing it. So, okay, maybe that preset is effective for you. Well, let's still use it in conjunction with perfectly clear on the back end to clean up the image. Because as you can see, if I go back to Lightroom and I show you this image that was perfectly clear, right? Here's our perfectly clear image. And if I open that up, if I open that image up next to the other image that we created here, right? I mean, it's a matter of taste. Some people might like the other one, but this to me is a better representation of the image that or the way I saw that scene, right? Here's our, okay, let me close that out. And I'm just going to open this image back up. So if we open this up, we could still make a finishing correction here because this is good processing. This is a merge, right? So this is about 4 or 5 images merged together, and there we go. Okay, I mean, it's giving us a whole different feel, right? Versus here, right? This is really blue, so I know that this is probably over processed, right? And it just, as you can see, there's a film. There's like this little filmy. You see that? If you look right up in here in the lights, you can actually see the difference. After, before, after. So that's a little bit more accurate, right? Versus here where you just have like that intensity of yellow versus here. It looks a little bit more blended. All right. So here's, I'm going to cancel that out. All right. Lance Sullivan. Oh, here we go. Perfectly clear for the architectural. So here's our blog. My next webinar is going to be on the 28th. So join me on the 28th from 3 to 4 o'clock. And we're going to talk about more landscape photography and how you can benefit from using perfectly clear. And I'm going to just switch right back over to some slides. We got about 3 minutes left. So that's what I call it, the creative zone, in terms of the way that we cropped and approached the image. There's a step in there that I call the religious point of view. I like to talk about it a lot. Your editing processes are going to be key. Even the editing processes before you take the picture, how you edit the picture in your mind is also a process as well. I want you to know that there are 3 types of edit workflows. There's in-camera, digital corrections, and enhancements. Sometimes you can sharpen your images, and on most pro cameras you can sharpen in camera. You can do a lot of corrections and fixes in camera. There's the digital ones, which we just done today, and then enhancements. So in this case, we used perfectly clear to enhance a few things that we already did, maybe to enhance our cleanup, on the image. So definitely perfectly clear's bat cleanup here did a great job, right? Workflows are layered. Keep that in mind. Your editing workflows are layered out into sections, and you want to keep it that way. That way, if one goes bad, you can just trash that. You don't have to trash the entire image or the entire scene. Bring your images into a master. You can go into perfectly clear and then out to what I call a corrected folder. That works beautifully. That way you always know that those images are really good foundations, and you don't have to completely start over, if you have to trash an image. And then there's a visual edit where you go through and you go in your masters folder and you visually select the photos that you're going to do. You put them into pics, into perfectly clear, out to corrected, and you can go straight to the client from there. I do that with my event photography a lot. Or you can go into an edited folder, right? Edited folder. From perfectly clear into an edited folder that you're going to use to make further enhancements and then out to a final. Either way you look at this, you should have some type of workflow. This is the most important thing. Image corrections are the foundation for creative enhancements, and I really want you to embrace that. Image corrections are the foundation. So Go in with a great image, whether it be on camera, imperfectly clear. I want you to think of perfectly clear as that tool that you can use outside of a normal situation where you can't white balance or you don't have time, you're running and gunning, because it happens. It's going to happen. If you're out there and you're shooting constantly, you're going to be running and gunning, and you're going to need those tools, and this is it. All right. If you have questions, feel free to email me, keith@keithbdixon.com. You can text me. Just go to my website, get my phone number off there, text me and say, hey, Keith, I had a question about this, I'm using perfectly clear, whatever the case may be. You want to share a tip? Maybe there's something you can tell me that you're doing in your workflow that makes sense, and I can share it with all the people that are viewing these webinars and following us. All right. And last but not least, I have a code for you to save some money. So not only did I save you some time, I'm going to save you some money today, right? Keith, BPC 15, and that'll save you 10%. So log on, get perfectly clear, save 10%. Believe me, this is my 18th year as a photographer. I've seen a lot of processing programs. This by far has allowed me to do a lot more and take on a lot more. Keep my operation as streamlined as possible in terms of processing. So jump on a board and get on the perfectly clear bandwagon with us. All right. That's all I got for you, folks. It's been great. I'll talk to you soon.